Hi and welcome back. My name is Dr. Alexis Koskin and I am your friendly public health professor here at ASU. And in this chapter, I'm going to talk about poverty during childhood and how it affects health outcomes in adulthood. So what you can see from these two maps and compared by date is that over time, there's been an increase in the number of children living in poverty. And now in these upcoming slides, we're going to talk about specifically how does it impact health other than having a lack of access to needed resources as well as having lack of access or lack of financial resources to pay for fresh and healthy foods, right? Or having the time to be physically active. There are other ways in which poverty impacts health, and we'll discuss those as well as what's been done in one very successful intervention to try to mitigate the effects of poverty experienced during childhood. So there are three main ways, three main types of effects of which childhood poverty impacts adult health. One is a latent effect. We'll talk about epigenetic influences in another upcoming lecture this week. We talk about stress and epigenetics and its outcome on adult health. But basically, this describes how your biography affects your biology, how stress, especially when it's experienced as a prolonged stressor, when it's severe, when there's a specific type of stressor called a toxic stress that's experienced during really important developmental periods, how that can in turn affect your physical and mental health. There are cumulative effects, such as the longer that you live in a negative environment, the worse off your health outcomes. So the longer and the deeper the poverty you're experiencing, the more negative outcomes you'll experience as an adult. And there are pathway effects where the experiences that you had during a childhood might shape the way you experience life as an adulthood without it necessarily affecting directly your biological programming. There are certain types of effects, direct health effects, as well as social implications of poverty, right? So some of the physical implications, there are higher infant mortality rates, there are higher rates of low birth weight babies, specifically when you have when a baby is in utero and there is a mother who is smoking or experiences high levels of depression. This can in turn impact the baby's health once it's been born. Lack of access to financial resources can lead to childhood hunger. By the way, childhood hunger has been linked to all types of negative behavioral outcomes. When children don't have the food that they need to stay sustained and have energy during the school hours, they could be misdiagnosed for all types of behavioral outcomes because they're hungry, right? I mean, we have this term that's hangry, right? But when you don't have enough food in your body, you can't stay focused and you have a hard time um, being able to contribute in a classroom setting. And the same happens for children when they can't focus because they're hungry, right? But often this gets misdiagnosed as a behavioral issue. There are also stress and distresses by not having the resources that you need, and also by growing up in an environment that is a bit more disadvantaged and is not a very stimulating environment. There's a greater incidence of disease, both chronic and infectious. For chronic diseases, there's the increased risk of anemia, so iron deficiency, as well as asthma in lower income homes. And over time, with longer experiences of poverty, this is linked to shorter longevity of life. Some of the social implications of poverty include stigma, being stigmatized, the use, needing to rely on programs that are aimed at benefiting those who use welfare programs, right? And those are highly stigmatized. However, again, they're such programs such as like SNAP, right? What used to be called the food stamp program has had great health benefits for those relying on this type of benefit program. There are higher rates of unplanned pregnancy, and also there are lower rates of readiness to begin attending school, which often leads to higher rates of dropout. There are higher incarceration rates and also reduced levels of work productivity once someone is an adult, working jobs in adolescence and early adulthood. So why does this occur? Why why does stress and why does poverty have such a negative impact on social life and physical health? Well, a researcher named Dr. Conger created something known as the family stress model, which is illustrated here. The three main outcomes of this model are hardship and stress, isolation and exclusion, and longer-term impact as an adult. And I just want to describe a little bit about what happens when someone experiences poverty, how that directly impacts children's health, how that impacts parenting indicators, and how that places extra stress on parents in terms of creating family dysfunction and how it has negative impacts on mental health as well as relationships. So in terms of hardship and stress, people with inadequate incomes typically experience difficulties in meeting basic costs, including food and accommodation and clothing, education costs, healthcare, utilities, transport, and recreation. And there's this stress of trying to balance these competing demands, which just adds extra stress to the caregivers of children. This also has a harmful impact of poverty on parents and children when it leads to stress and alienation. When parents are continually juggling the stressors of finances and financial security. And in turn, this impacts children because the parents are experiencing stress and unhappiness, and that might in turn direct the way that they actually parent children and their experiences as parents. There's social isolation and exclusion. In lower income families, children might feel isolated due to parents' lack of attention. If parents are juggling multiple jobs or not able to spend as much quality time with their children, the children might feel isolated. Other ways in which poverty impacts isolation is that children who live in lower income homes are less likely to live in safer neighborhoods, be able to play with their friends once they're away from school, be involved in extracurricular activities such as sport and music, and be able to take breaks the same way that children in higher income homes can. And then the longer term impacts, family poverty and low socioeconomic status are consistently related to poor school performance, low school retention rates. Young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds tend to be those who are more likely to drop out when compared to dropout rates. It tends to be from people from lower income homes. And it's generally marked by lower achievement at school, lower levels of employment, and just overall poor conditions in the labor market once you become an adult. So again, these are long-term outcomes and doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who grows up in a lower income home is at risk for these outcomes. It just increases the likelihood the lower income the family is and the longer that they experience poverty. There are mitigating factors such as early education, such as having multiple caregivers for the child. But again, these are just generalizations of how this can impact social outcomes and health outcomes over time. So one intervention that's been cited time and time again as a project that aimed to mitigate the negative effects of poverty was something called the Abecedarian Project. I'm probably mispronouncing it. Abecedarian Project. Abecedarian Project. There we go. So this is a really famous randomized controlled trial which involved about 120 parents who had infants and who were living in poverty. And this was conducted in North Carolina between 1972 to 1985. In this In this program, those who were in the experimental group, who weren't in the control group, received full-time, high-quality educational intervention at a child care setting from infancy through age 5, 7 days a week. Families and children had access to this really high-quality, very personalized educational intervention. At a younger age, so in infancy, there was a teacher-to-child ratio of one teacher for every 3 children, and up to age 5, there was one caregiver for every, or one teacher for every 6 children. So this was a highly personalized intervention in which each child had a very individual's prescription of games, and different activities to try to encourage them to engage academically um, in this educational program. So some of the activities focus on social and emotional and cognitive areas with a real emphasis on language improvement in the study. And here are just some of the outcomes. So overall, children that were in the intervention group scored much higher in terms of mean IQ scores over time as compared to the control group. Also, they were much more likely to go to either go into skilled labor or complete a 4-year college education as compared to the control group. When looking at other outcomes, we found that this was a study that was conducted with the children who graduated from this program. At age 30, children who completed the program were more likely to have a bachelor's degree, more likely to have a job, and were more likely to delay parenthood in order to pursue their career development. And by age 35, when looking at health measures, they were more likely to have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of prehypertension and hypertension, lower blood pressure, lower vitamin D deficiency. So overall, in terms of these particular health markers, they fared better than those who were in the control group that didn't receive this really intensive educational program. And overall, the program estimated that it saved about $2.50 per $1 spent on the program. So it definitely had a cost savings benefit by that early investment. So I just thought this was really interesting because this was a study that really did target a social determinant of health among a disadvantaged population of parents and their children who were growing up in poverty. There was a way to mitigate the negative effects. This program didn't stop the parents, didn't necessarily give the parents money for them to be able to move out of poverty, but it was a very intensive educational program that mitigated the negative effects on their children's health and their children's well-being and their social and later economic development. So I just thought this was absolutely fascinating as an example of focusing on social determinant of health and having a true impact on physical health downstream. So your book discusses other policy implications of ways to impact and to mitigate the negative effects of poverty. Your book describes how there really need to be fair taxations, as well as reducing tax cuts for the super wealthy. I know this might seem controversial given the recent tax cuts that were passed, but the way this idea of trickle-down economics really previously has not positively impacted the lower income classes. So your book describes the need for these taxes really to focus on some of these social services like impacting positively education and providing food benefits, the SNAP benefits, and other social programs to try to level the playing field, because poverty is not healthy for anyone. It has negative impacts on the people directly affected by poverty, but in terms, it also has negative impacts on those who aren't impoverished. So your textbook in chapter 3 has really interesting insight on globally what occurs when people are living in poverty. Um, and so they also make recommendations of ensuring that people have wage guarantees. That could mean increasing the minimum wage income, um, as well as creating legislation that ensures that certain people aren't marginalized from being able to use um, or excluded from different types of social programs, as well as other social determinants of health, such as access to work, access to education, and also access to benefit programs. So again, your textbook, chapter 3, especially towards the end of the chapter, has some policy implications as to ways to um, focus on the social determinant of health of income to later downstream prevent some of the outcomes of living in poverty.